These are the Arctic Archives. I'm Josh Federico. In this episode, H.O. Red Williams is interviewed by Bill Schneider in Fairbanks, Alaska on March 7, 1985. Recording number 85-21, courtesy of the University of Alaska Fairbanks Oral History Program. Red Williams begins by describing how he came to Alaska with little more than his rifle and what would fit in his backpack, and eventually got into aviation. He then shares a number of highlights and stories from his long career as a bush pilot. Here's their conversation. Enjoy.
Today is March 7th, 1985, and we had the pleasure of being with H.O. Williams, Red Williams.
Some pleasure.
Some pleasure. And we're out here at your place overlooking Fairbanks from the hills. Let's start a little bit by chatting about how you decided to come to Alaska and then how you got involved in the university, and then we'll get into flying.
Well, I came to Alaska like many of these young people you see today. I was the hippie of my day, if you will. I had a pack on my back. We didn't have long hair in those days, but had all the other characteristics. I first came to Alaska just because I graduated from college down below. There was no work around, and I was all over the country, and finally wound up in Alaska. And I stopped in Ketchikan for a while and worked on a fish trap, and then I took the ship to Valdez and hitchhiked my way up from Valdez to Fairbanks. Rode and got a ride with one of Gezzy's trucks. Wound up in Fairbanks at 11 o'clock at night with 2 bits in my pocket. I spent that 2 bits the next morning down in the old China Cafe for a stack of cakes and a cup of coffee, and I was stony broke. I walked around town, finally got tired of carrying my pack and my rifle, and I stood them up against the telephone pole down in front of Wells Alaska Motors, which was located where Aurora Motors is now, and pursued employment without a burden on my back. The Federal Employment Office was a cubbyhole over on 4th Street next to the former location of the Christian Science Church. So I went there and I looked in the door and I saw 4 or 5 young fellows sitting on the bench waiting to get interviewed. So I just turned and started canvassing the businesses in town for employment. Didn't succeed in finding any. Finally came back to the employment office, and as I started in, I decided to go in and sit down, and the fellows were still sitting there. So I started in the door. I bumped into a real tall fellow, big man. His name was George Gilbertson. He looked down at me and he said, "Boy, you want to go to work?" And I said, "Yes, that's what I'm here for." So I said, "Well, come on with me." I didn't ask him what we were going to do. I didn't care. I was broke. So we started out together. He looked down at me again. He said, "Will you work on Saturday?" And I said, "Yes, work anytime, day or night." He said, "Well, come on with me." Well, the girl at the desk said, "I haven't signed him up yet." And he said, "I don't give a damn. Come on with me, boy." So we went off. It turned out that all these fellows on the bench were Seventh-day Adventists and wouldn't work on Saturday. And ever since that time, I've had a very soft spot in my heart for Seventh-day Adventists. Hadn't been for them, I wouldn't have had that job. Well, George and his brother and another fellow named Bill Schneider had a mine out off Gilmore Creek, right above where the tracking station is now on Hill Creek. And I worked there until middle of September, the freeze up. And then I went into town, and I decided that I like Fairbanks, and I was going to spend the winter here, see what it was like. So I acquired lodging at Francis Doyle's boarding house, which was located then where the National Bank of Alaska is in the Northward building is now. And the board and room was rather reasonable. It was $68 a month. I was there a few days, and a fellow whom I had met earlier suggested to me that we go out and take a look at the university out of town. It's a small school. He and I both had graduated from larger schools. So we went out just to look at the place. And while there, we found that if we were enrolled in the school, we could stay there for $45 a month, room and board, which was cheaper than $68 a month. So we did enroll. We were there a few days, and we got a room together. And my roommate suggested to me that we go check over the flying course that the school was offering at the time. Well, the federal government in about 1939 started a program called the Civil Pilot Training Program to create interest in military aviation among the young men of the country, trying to catch up with the Germans. And they had a course offered at the University of Alaska, which was a land-grant college. And it was taught by Dick Regal, who was a professor of geology and happened to be a first lieutenant in the Air Corps Reserve. Well, I was one of the 10 picked. My roommate was too old for the program, and I signed up for the program. But there was a little clause in the application which said if you completed the course, you would apply. You promised to apply for admission to the Army Air Corps Aviation Cadet Program. Oh, I signed it. Completed the course successfully, and at the completion of the course, Dick Regal had an application for Army Air Corps Cadet Program. So I signed that too and went off and forgot about it. Well, the next summer, I received a little notice from Uncle Sam, said greetings from the President of the United States, and told me to report for physical examination and processing to become an aviation cadet. So I was processed at what is now Fort Wainwright, was Ladd Field at that time, and I was physically fit and mentally competent at the time, so I became an aviation cadet, and that way I became active in aviation and in education. It was real planning.
Okay.
I went to California. There was no training program in Alaska, of course, and I trained in primary in Santa Maria, California, basic in Moffett Field in California. Then I completed and graduated from advanced flying school at Luke Field on March 16th, 1985, which happens also to be my wedding date.
What's that date again?
March 16th, 1942. Well, I was engaged in military flying, and in 1945, in September, I made a flight to Fairbanks, at which time I ran into Dr. James C. Ryan, for whom Ryan Junior High is named, who at the time was Commissioner of Education and had been one of my education instructors at the University of Alaska. And he offered me several jobs at the time which were open, or we talked about several jobs which were open, but I was still in the service and was going to be held in the service for another 6 months after the war. But after getting back down the States, I got a telegram. I'd given him my address, and I got a telegram saying that they desperately needed a teacher at T Harbor because the older woman who was teaching that found that the daily drive from Juneau to T Harbor was too much for her. Well, I wired Dr. Ryan back that if he could get me out of the service, well, I'd take the job. Well, he contacted Governor Greening and Tony Diamond, our delegate to Congress, and somebody else. Who else? Who else did I name? Well, between the three of them, they got me out of service. And about 2 weeks later, Jane and I and our daughter were on the boat going to Juneau. Well, we stayed that year at T Harbor, but in the springtime, I was offered, after my contract with T Harbor was over, I was offered a job with the Fish and Wildlife as a pilot mechanic stationed in Fairbanks, which was my first love, and twice the salary, and I couldn't turn it down. So we wound up in Fairbanks then, in the local office here with Fish and Wildlife Service, and I stayed there for a year, at which time I decided to go into a flying business for myself. And in about June of 1947, I went out to the States and bought an airplane and flew it back and started rustling around on my own.
Were you stationed then in Fairbanks when you set up the farm?
Well, no. I'd really been sold a bill of goods about the need and the opportunity down on the Kuskokwim in a little village called Antioch. And I took my business down to Antioch to operate. But I starved out in Antioch, and I came back to Fairbanks, and I found that my business gradually centered around Circle Hot Springs. And the tourists wanting to go to Fort Yukon, they drive to Circle Hot Springs, and then I would fly them to Fort Yukon. And on the weekend traffic there was enough that I made quite a bit of change that first year and decided in the fall of 47 that I would locate over in that area. Well, I couldn't afford to rent a cabin at Circle Hot Springs for my family, so Central was only 8 miles away, and Central had a little field, and the telephone line was up in those days. We had a telephone line between Central and Circle Hot Springs, so I bought a little place in Central, and in the spring of 48, we moved into Central and have been located there ever since. In the fall of 47, I decided that I would get a mechanic's license. And there was never any real big money, but the major portion of my income was from tourists in the summertime. So around the 1st of October, I enrolled in Globe Vocational School in Globe, Arizona, and we spent the winter down there while I was getting my mechanic's license. I got a mechanic's license and ground instructor mechanic's license and so forth. And I also got the ground instructor's license in meteorology, navigation, and civil air regulations so that I could if I wanted to start a flying school. I had that wild hair about starting a flying school and operating it with all these licenses, but that never came to fruition. Other things happened. So we stayed and tried and had some good years at Circle Hot Springs. But in 1950, the fires were so thick in the interior of Alaska that I decided to tie my operation down. And I wouldn't fly anymore. There were too many people getting killed. And I had a wife and all these kids. I decided I didn't want to get killed. So I was offered a job flying for Transocean Airlines at Point Barrow. There was no smoke up there, nothing to burn. So I took the job, tied my aircraft down, and took a job with Transocean. I stayed with them a year. And then in 51, I went back and flew for the Military Air Transport Service, flying the Korean airlift. So, and for a year, then the war got over down there in Korea, and we came back to Alaska. And I tried to operate the flying business, but the airports had been expanded, and Wien Airlines were flying in with their DC-3s and F-47s and so forth, and I couldn't compete with them. And eventually, I decided to get out of the flying business and get back into teaching school, because that was really my first love. And then in 53, I taught school at Nikolai down on the Kuskokwim for part of the year. I was the fourth teacher in there. The other three couldn't stand it and it took off. One of them just got off the airplane, looked at the village, got back on the airplane. They finally asked me to go down there, and I could stand it, so I went down and finished it. The next year, Jane and I taught two-room school at Fort Yukon. We stayed there 2 years, and then in 56 we went to Cantwell and taught down there. But in the summer times, during these periods of time, I was still operating the flying service at Central. But in 56, I sold my airplane and got out of my own flying service. But in 58, I went back to flying in the summer times for Fairbanks Air Service, and for about 3 or 4 years, I flew summers for Fairbanks Air Service and taught school in Fairbanks at Lathrop High School. I gave up flying commercially in 1960 because as long as I flew in my spare time, I couldn't grow professionally. I couldn't go to school. I only had a bachelor's degree. I wasn't working toward my master's. I hadn't been to college for 25 years. I was getting further and further behind in education. So I quit flying in 1960 and started going to summer school in order to get my master's degree and so forth, and get my administrative certificate and get into administration. But I quit flying commercially.
Talking about when you came in to flying.
Well, I came in, I actually began my flying in Alaska as a student pilot in 1940. By that time, the pioneering of aviation was over. The pioneers, most of them were still alive at the time. And I had the good fortune of meeting many of them. Like Sam White was like a father to me. He gave me much advice many times all around the country. I ran into Sam many, many places. And Harold Gillum and the Weens. I knew the Weens. But these people were the ones who are the real bush pilots, if you will. they're the ones who pioneered the aviation here when there were no fields. Now, I came in, and in my mind, sometimes I consider them the first wave of bush pilots. There are those who sometimes call me a bush pilot, but I wouldn't put myself in their class at all. I was in the second wave of bush pilots, if you will. I flew all over the country around here when there were very few navigational aids, but there were airfields at most villages, most every place I went, there was an airfield. All I had to do was find it. I didn't have to make it. And this first wave of people, pilots, if you will, landed on sandbars in front of the villages and so forth. The only times I landed in front of the villages was when I was on floats, landed in the summertime, or on skis in the wintertime. And the other times I landed on the fields that had been built. Sometimes I think of a third wave of pilots who have come in and who are very proficient in instrument flying and use of navigational aids, and who are actually doing flying, to me, in my opinion, much more dangerous than the flying that I did. These young fellows now are very proficient in keeping a schedule. So the day of the bush pilot is over, though. You can't, there's no such thing in my mind right now as bush flying. No such thing as bush flying. The airplanes are so much more reliable. The airfields are larger, and they're all over the country. There are navigational aids. There are lights on many of these little villages, so you can go in at night. And you can call it bush flying if you want to, but it's no different from flying from Chicago to St. Louis. Fact of the matter, it's easier. The only time in my life I ever got lost was between Rockford, Illinois and Dayton, Ohio. I was really lost. I mean, the railroads ever going every which direction. There were towns every place I looked, and there were highways. Up here, if you run into a highway, you know where it is. You know which one it is. If you run into a railroad, man, you know exactly which one that is. Down there was so many railroads, and I finally had to land a place and find out where I was. I couldn't. Too many towns. I was lost. The only time in my life I was ever lost. Between Rockford and Dayton, Ohio.
So you were kind of the second wave.
Yes, definitely a second wave. Not the pioneers. Sort of like the cleanup gang, if you will.
And the younger people that you see now flying around, they're relying much more on instruments and
sophisticated aircraft, much more, and sophisticated navigational aids. Yes.
But do you think that in their efforts to keep schedules and stuff, that they're more dangerous?
They themselves are not more dangerous, but the condition, in my book, the condition in which they're flying are more dangerous. I'm the livest coward in this country. I would never fly single-engine instruments. These people are flying single-engine instruments daily. The man upstairs would never give me a guarantee that engine would keep running. If he'd given me a guarantee that engine, if I'd known all the time that engine would keep running, I would fly single-engine instruments. Once I was flying a Norseman on floats up on the Arctic coast between Tigveriak Island and Barter Island. There were a group of men from the Coast and Geodetic Survey who based on Tigveriak Island, and they had been in there since April. And we were closing down the camps. And the camps were all coming in Tigveriak. In fact, I was the one who was bringing them in. I brought them in Tigveriak. Then I was to take them to Barter Island. Now, Norseman is a 9-passenger, single-engine airplane, and I was on floats. Well, there was a DC-3 in Barter Island from Wien, and I was to fly them to Barter Island. They were to get on the DC-3, and then they were to fly to Fairbanks. I started out from Tigveriak, and I got out about 15 or 20 minutes over toward the mouth of the Canning River. I ran into a whiteout. I couldn't see a thing. This was the latter part of September. All the freshwater lakes were freezing up. I was still on floats landing in salt water. I ran in this whiteout, and I couldn't see anything, and I made a 180-degree turn on the instruments. I had an instrument rating. I'd had an instrument rating for 15 years or more. No, that's not true. I had an instrument rating for, about 7 or 8 years. I knew how to fly instruments, but I made a 180-degree turn on the instruments and got back out in the sunshine where I could see, and I started back for Tigberriac. And the fellow was sitting alongside of me, and he said, "Hey, where are you doing? What are you doing?" He could see that we were going the other direction. And I said, "I'm going back to Tigberriac." He said, "What for? The plane's waiting on us in Barter Island." I said, "Yeah, but I can't see. It's white out there." "Well, you were with me." I couldn't see. He pointed out over the ocean where the sun was shining several miles out that way, and he said, "It's clear out there." And I said, "Yeah, but I'm not going out there. I never would fly out of gliding distance of land, even on floats, because it's a long walk on water." Well, he said, "Well, Farrington would." Well, Farrington was the fellow that had this run before I had it. And to this date, they haven't found him or his passenger, his airplane either. He disappeared one day. We had Dr. Hamilton with him in the airplane. So I just looked over to him and I said, "Where's Farrington now?" That shut him up. I went back to Tigberriac, and I'm here talking to you. I don't know where Farrington is. I'm a live coward.
Well, I think that's real important. No, we used to say that too. We used to say that that those that took chances would eventually get.
Yep, they did. Now, there's no one who's flown any length of time, especially no one who's flown the length of time that I flew, who didn't get in some jackpots at times. And I'm lucky that I survived a number of them, but because I took some chances, but I didn't know they were chances. I learned from these chances so that I didn't get into the same types of situations again. But you're bound to get into a situation that you haven't been in before. And if you survive it, you learn not to get into that situation again.
Give me an example of how you've learned from some of these situations you've been in.
Well, one of my most vivid memories of being frightened in a situation occurred when I was at Antioch. There was a rather heavy person there whose name was Wilson. He had an interest in a mine way up in the mountains. And I had a small airplane. I had a Piper PA-12, which was only a 3-place airplane. But he chartered me once to fly up to his mine. And we got up in the mountains at about 3,000 feet elevation, where he had a little strip. It was not too long a strip. It also was on a grade. It had a fairly good grade to it. And I went in and landed there, and this fellow weighed maybe 220 pounds, started throwing a bunch of tools and iron and stuff in the back end of the airplane, and finally I just told him, knock it off. That was, I had more than I wanted to carry. So then I had to make the choice. There was a good wind blowing. It was blowing downhill. And I had to make the choice of whether to take off uphill into the wind or downhill with the wind. And I'd never been in that situation, in a situation as critical as that one, and I made the wrong choice. I elected to take off uphill into the wind, which was all right as far as the field, the length getting off the field was concerned. It worked. I got off the field. The only problem was the ground was rising as fast as I could climb. And I was hitting right into a box canyon. And the ground was coming up to me almost as fast as I could fly. There was no hope. The farther I go into the canyon, the less room I would have to make a turn. It was squeezing me in. And I had no choice, finally, but to just make a desperate turn, a steep turn, overloaded, low speed, never really got up good speed. And I made the turn, and I just mushed around in this turn. I really wasn't flying well, and I missed that other mountain over there on the other side of this steep mountain about 50 feet. And from that situation, I learned. The thing I learned is don't take off, period. Wait till it's calm and then take off downhill. I could have sat there for a week. And then sometime in that week, the wind would have quit and I could have taken off downhill. That's the type of situation I'm talking about. Never again will I take off into the wind, into a box canning. Regardless how well it gets off the ground, it's got to be able to climb faster than the ground is rising. That's an example of the type of thing I was making.
Some of those people that you flew around in the early days, you mentioned some fur buyers and some of the finagling that went on there.
Well, one of my favorite fur buyers was a fellow named Leo Kay. He actually was a member of the Kozlowski family from Palmer and Anchorage. Also, they had clothing stores down there. But he changed his name to Kay, and he ran a jewelry store and a curio store here in Fairbanks, Leo Kay. Once Leo and I were on a trip in the middle of the winter. It was very cold. And we had planned to go from Fairbanks to Ruby, and then from Ruby we're going over to Hughes, and then Hughes over into the Kobuk, the Shungnak, and then down to Kayana, and then on eventually wind up at Kotzebue and then Nome and back. Well, we made it as far as Ruby the first day, and lo and behold, after we'd settled in the Mamie Wiggs Roadhouse for the night, who showed up but Jim McGoffin and Muskrat Johnny Schwegler. Well, you'd have to know something about fur buyers to understand the real rivalry and sometimes enmity that's between fur buyers. And Leo was just scared to death that Johnny and Jim were going the same way we were. So in order to get we were flying the same airplanes. So if we were going the same route, the one who took off first would get there first and get the furs. So Leo asked me to go stay all night with Sam White, my old real original bush pilot buddy, and get up early, and we'd beat Johnny and Jim off. Well, I stayed all night with Sam. Got up about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning in the wintertime, mind you. Heated up my airplane about 30, 40 below zero. Got it warm and ready to run. Then went up quietly to the bunkhouse where I was supposed to be sleeping, but Leo was actually sleeping. And woke him up. He quietly dressed, slipped out, came down, and we took off. Long before daylight in wintertime. Night was clear, though. About halfway to Hughes, I heard Jim McGoffin filing a flight pan with Fairbanks radio from Ruby to Fairbanks. So all this hassle of sleeping on the floor at Sam's and getting up and flying at night in the wintertime was unnecessary. I had to laugh at Leo. Fur buyers are something else.
You had another story there, too.
Well, this concerned another fur buyer. But I was weathered in one time for 8 days with Dominic Bernetti down at Koyukuk. I had a fur buyer with me. Now, Dominic at that time was well up in the 70s, and he had a very attractive Indian wife who was about 20 years his junior or so. And this fur buyer kept making passes at Dominic's wife. And I was worried to death all this time that Dominic would kick us out. And we were there for 8 days because it never got above 50 below zero all the time we were there. And here's this guy trying to mess up our happy home. And the same guy did the same thing at Shungnak. And I was there on a New Year's Day of some early 50s, I've forgotten which one. And there was a teacher there who was from Tennessee, big old ex-cop. He weighed about 240 pounds, about 6'3". And he had a very attractive wife. And it was cold outside. And we were there for 3 days. Ice fog so thick you could cut it with a knife. Between 50 and 60 below, and the wind was blowing 30, 40 miles an hour. And we just couldn't move. And very kindly, this teacher was letting us sleep on the floor in the living room. Well, we flipped. I sometimes had the couch, and sometimes the fur buyer had the couch. But that was our accommodation. They were feeding us, and at least we were keeping warm. And again, he's making passes this guy's wife all the time. And sometimes I think that fur buyers just don't have good sense. They don't know how to.
You were saying fur buyers sometimes just don't have good sense.
Yeah, they don't know when they're well off.
Well, you must have had some pretty exciting adventures in your times.
Well, like all pilots, you get into situations sometimes that, whether they're exciting or not, they're scary. I suppose that one of my most vivid memories of excitement or fear or whatever it is also has a rather amusing slant to it. It happened when Jane and I were teaching school in Fort Yukon. I came one Saturday in the Fairbanks in the wintertime. It was quite cold, to conduct some business. I had a young chap with me from over there and we stayed all night in Fairbanks and then started back for Fort Yukon the next day on Sunday. I was flying in a Ronco sedan on skis, and we were fairly heavily loaded with all the stuff we acquired. And we had full tanks of fuel, and we took off for Fort Yukon. Well, we went straight across from Fairbanks up to the Big Bend of the Beaver, and then we went down the Beaver and broke out over the Yukon Flats there, near where Birch Creek Jimmy's village is. And as we got over the flats there began to build up a layer of ice fog. And we were on top of it. There was no problem. So we flew on to Fort Yukon, and Fort Yukon was just socked in. Couldn't see anything about it. I was talking to the CAA communicator there, and he said, well, I hear you, and all this kind of stuff, but I couldn't see to get down through this ice fog. And I tried to go down to the mouth of the Birch, or rather the Porcupine, and come back under it, and I couldn't do that. So finally I gave up and started back to Fairbanks. Well, I got back down to the White Mountains there, and lo and behold, that nice clear stretch of air that I'd been in, that space, vertical space, had socked in too. And I had to keep climbing and climbing and climbing, and finally I climbed up to about 8,000 feet, and I was still in it. Then I got into the soup, couldn't get over it, and I headed for Fairbanks, because Fairbanks was giving on the radio about, I think, 1,800 to 2,000 foot ceiling, which was fine. Well, I in this soup a little while, and I looked at my gas gauges, and they were beginning to be very low. Well, there was no range lag over where I was. The range lag was several miles to the east of me, and I began to realize I didn't have enough gas to go over and get on the range lag and ride it in. So I called in to Fairbanks Radio and asked them to, since I didn't know precisely where I was in the soup. I was heading in the right direction, but in the soup. I called Fairbanks Radio and asked them to have Murphy Dome take a radar sight on me and give me a precise location and compute me a heading for Fairbanks, the shortest distance. And they said, fine, continue. I think my number was 36 Hotel, and they said, continue as you are. I flew on maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and I hadn't heard anything from them. And so I called Fairbanks radio and told them that my gauges were reading empty, and I would like the closest, I'd like a plot and the most direct route to Fairbanks from Murphy Dome radar site. Well, they hadn't heard, so continue as you are. Well, I flew on a few more minutes, beginning to get worried because my gas gauges are bouncing on empty. I called them in and said, what's the status? They said, we haven't heard from them. Continue as you are. So I went on a few more minutes, and lo and behold, my engine quit me. I'm sitting there about 8,000 feet in the soup, can't see anything. My engine quit me. Well, I didn't know where I was. All I could do was just hope, pray, if you will. I was too busy to pray. I was just hoping. So I let down. I put the nose down, and I was already flying the instruments, so I glided straight ahead all the time, just hoping I didn't run into a mountain. My altimeter kept going down, 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 and finally it was down below 2,000 feet, and I broke through the overcast without running into any mountains, and I was right over Creamer's potato field, which is where the dog mushers are right now. Here I had this great, it was dark, of course, by now. Here I had this great big field with no obstructions, and I landed. It was dark enough. When I landed, I broke my shock cables on my landing gear, but I still had my safety cables holding the gear together. And that's all that happened. But I could have run into one of those mountains over there. The thing is, I forgot. When my engine quit me, and this is the amusing part, I gave a mayday. Mayday, mayday, Fairbanks radio, mayday, 36 Hotel, or whatever my number was at the time. Mayday, mayday. And they said, continue as you are. Roger, 36 Hotel, continue as you are. That's the only time I ever swore in the radio on the air. And I'm afraid I did give that fella a little bit of my mind. I'm sitting up there, 8,000 feet, engine quit me, in the soup, and the guy's saying, as if everything is normal, continue as you are. I'll never forget that. Continue as you are.
And you had another incident?
Well, I was when I went to work for the Fish and Wildlife, I picked up an Army observation plane, surplus Army observation plane, an L-1, down at Ketchikan. I flew down from Juneau to Ketchikan with old Sassine, who was really one of the original bush pilots in Alaska.
What was his name?
Sassoon. Old Sass, we called him. But I picked up the L-1 down at Ketchikan. I flew it up to Juneau, stayed all night in Juneau, docked at a commercial dock there and had them fill my airplane up with gas and so forth. The next day I was headed for Cordova because I was to patrol fishermen in Cordova for a while on temporary duty there. So I flew along the Gulf of Alaska, went around Cape Spencer and Lituya Bay, and hugging the edge of the shore there, I flew across the Gulf of Alaska and finally landed up in Yakutat out in the bay and taxied up to the wharf. It was Sunday. There wasn't anybody open anywhere. I couldn't get any gas, but I had plenty of gas to go on to Cordova because I had main tank and I had an auxiliary tank that was built into the airplane. So I really like to have full tanks, but I had enough gas to get there. Well, I took off from Cordova and I flew on past Yagataga and I was going across Bering Glacier, and my fuel warning pressure light started to flash, which told me that I was running on my main tank and told me it was time to switch over to my auxiliary tank. So I did. I switched over to the auxiliary tank and the fuel pressure light kept flashing. Well, I switched back and forth a couple times, then I finally switched it off from the auxiliary tank and let it run, and the doggone engine quit on that auxiliary tank, which means I wasn't getting the fuel out of the auxiliary tank. It's the first time I'd used the auxiliary tank. It's a new airplane to me, first time I'd ever flown the airplane, so I figured I had a block line or something. So I flipped it back over onto the main tank where it wasn't completely empty. It was just giving me warning that it was going to be empty very shortly. And I was over Bering Glacier, which is not the best place in the world to have a forced landing, especially if you're on floats. But I got across Bering Glacier and I got over the Bering River, which was, and I breathed a sigh of relief. Because I looked down the Bering River several miles and I saw a cannery, a fish cannery down there. Oh, that was great. Well, I landed in the Bering River. I didn't fly down to the cannery. I landed in the Bering River because I wanted to save whatever gas I had to taxi up to the cannery. The engine was still running, though the pressure gauge was reading red. So I landed out in the middle of the river and floated down to the cannery. And as I got very, very close to the cannery, I could see that place was completely deserted. The buildings were falling in, the wharf was gone, the pilings were sticking up. But I had no choice. I was there. At least there was some shelter there. So I taxied up to the beach in front of the cannery, and then I started looking around for a hose or a container or something I could siphon the gas out of this emergency tank and put it in my main tank. Well, I finally found an old piece of hose and a can that I could use and so forth. And I waded out to now, while I'm doing all this, the tide has gone out and I'm sitting high and dry because the river was affected by tide there. I'm sitting high and dry. Well, that's fine. I didn't have to wade out. But I went out and I stuck the hose down in the tank and started to siphon, and the hose went all the way down, wasn't even wet. Then it dawned on me as I taken the cap off that the little vent line, which should have been pointing forward for pressure, had been put on backwards, and it was pointing backwards, so consequently a vacuum had been formed on that little vent, and then in this flight, my whole tank had siphoned dry. The mechanic had put the tank on. See, I learned from that. Never trust anybody to put your gas caps on. Put them on yourself. But there I was sitting. I had no fuel to siphon. I was sitting out of gas at a deserted cannery on the Bering River. Well, then I started really, all I had was a couple of candy bars and a .38 pistol strapped on my side, and that was it. That was my emergency. So I went up to the cannery, the old building, started looking around for a place or anything where I could sleep. And as I went in these old buildings here in bear tracks about 1.5 feet wide, these big brown bears had been going through there regularly, so that made me wonder where I was going to stay. So I started looking for high places that they couldn't get at. And as I was doing this, I heard an airplane. And I ran out on the beach, and way down the ways I could see a float plane coming from the direction of Cordova. And I took off my shirt, and I ran down to the airplane, near the airplane, and on high and dry, and started waving my shirt. And bless his heart, the guy saw me. Red Underwood from the Cordova Flying Service.
What's his name again?
Red Underwood. And he landed out in the water, which was way out past my airplane, and I waited out there and then told him what my problem was. And he said, well, he was on a charter, and he had to take this fella over to where he was, but he'd be back in 2 or 3 hours, and he'd land and we'd take some of his gas and put it in my airplane. So I stayed there 2 or 3 hours, and he came back and he landed, and we siphoned out 10 gallons of gas of his airplane and put it into mine. And then he took off, and then I sat there for several more hours waiting for the tide to come back in. And I finally took off. I landed in Cordova 9 or 10 o'clock at night. It was still a little light. I landed on Eak Lake. I was on a flight plan. I was at least 6, 7 hours overdue. No one had inquired. The 2 agents for whom I was going to fly there in Cordova, one of them was in a poker game down in the cannery. The other was in the show. The FAA, or the CAA at that time, which was supposed to, hadn't even reported that I was overdue. I was on a flight plan. And I was really unhappy with that whole bunch there. But what I learned from that was always check my gas caps myself. That.
Back when you were flying after the war, there was some demand for flights, eh?
Oh, yes. Aviation itself was booming, but actually there was a glut of pilots on the market, and it was terrifically difficult to get a job as a pilot. Pilot's jobs were premium. That's one of the reasons why a number of people went into the flying business for themselves. There just wasn't any other way if you wanted to stay in flying, to keep flying, except to buy your own airplane and start hustling with it. Now, there were the Arctic contractors. Well, the Navy started exploration I believe, in 1944, and up at Point Barrow in Pet 4. And that was a source of employment for pilots in Alaska for a number of years. But that was only good for about 20 pilots. There were about 10 who would be stationed at Barrow, and then about 10 who would fly what they call they fly the C-46s and the C-47s between Fairbanks and Barrow, the supply line, the milk run they used to call them. And then, of course, the Coast and Geodetic Survey were up there operating at the time, but they subcontracted to the Arctic contractors and used the Arctic contractors' planes at the same rate. Fact of the matter is, I flew for a season and a half for the Coast and Geodetic Survey. As I told you in the early instance, I was flying from around Tigberriac Island. The Coast and Geodetic Survey and I parted company in about May or June of 51. I was doing all their flying. I was flying for Transocean, who had the contract with Arctic contractors, but I was assigned to do all the Coast and Geodetic Survey flying. And one day, it was earlier than that, it must have been in April, or early part of May, but it was blowing cats and dogs, and it was white out, and blowing snow, and nobody was moving. And I was in the Quonset hut where the crew quarters were, and the phone rang, and it was the commander from the Coast and Geodetic Survey, and he said, "Hey, Red," he says, "we had a bad accident over at Oloktok Point." He said, "The man is awfully badly burned. We got to get him in." I said to him, as a commander, I said, "Have you looked out lately?" He said, "Yes, I know the weather is bad." He said, "But this man is terribly burned." He said, "Well, we've got to get him in and save his life." So I said, "All right, I'll see what I can do." So I called up the field and told the mechanics out there to warm up my airplane, fuel it up, get ready. I was going to go to Oloktok Point. Old Irv Crane, who was a Canadian bush pilot from La Paz, Manitoba, who was working for us, volunteered to go with me. And I told him, I said, "Well, Irv is the only one guy can fly this airplane at a time. And there's no use both of us getting killed. I said, you might as well stay here." So he stayed. I went out the field, the airplane, and they took a weasel and hauled me over on the lake. Of course, the airplane was on skis and the lake was frozen. We couldn't see anything, but I knew the lake was long enough to take off on. And they hauled me over there with a weasel and put me on the downwind side of the lake and turned me loose. Immediately the wind straightened the airplane up, and I was headed in the right direction. Wind was blowing 40, 50 miles an hour. But this old airplane is a heavy airplane. So I took off on the gauges, and I got up about 200-300 feet and just stayed there. I couldn't see anything, but I could now and then catch a glimpse of the ground. I couldn't see forward. So I knew where Oloktok Point was. So I got up about 200 feet because there weren't any ice, and I got out flying over the ocean. But the ocean ice is very rough, but I knew there weren't any icebergs out there or humps any higher than 200 feet. So when I got out at what I thought was the right timing, I let down just a little bit so I could now and then see. Now I was out over the ocean, and the land bank there was 10, 15 feet high. And so when I hit that land bank, when I crossed it, I could pick it up. I knew that I was over land. So I made a turn and got back and kept the land just off my right where I could see it. I could just barely make it out. I finally came to the camp at Oloktok Point, and I could see it. And I went out over the ocean, made a downwind turn, and went down a little ways and came back and got alongside the bank where I could see it and let down, and finally felt my way down and landed on the ice. I'd been there before. I knew where the ice was cleared. And I landed on the ice and taxied up to even where they came down from the camp to the landing strip there on the ice. Well, I left my engine running, and in a strong wind, idling engine cools off much more rapidly than an engine that's not idling and covered. So I sat there a few minutes. My engine was going to get cold. So the temperature's quite cold, 30, 35 below zero, and this 40, 50 knot wind blowing. And finally, I shut the engine off, got out and fought the engine cover and put it on, and started walking up to the camp. Well, I just got up to the bank, and I saw a guy carrying a duffel bag coming down over the ridge. And I walked up to him, and he said, Red, are you in a big hurry? I said, yeah. I said, there's a guy burned here. I got to get him back to Barrow. He said, I'm the guy with burned. He says, that happened yesterday. And he says, there's an awful good movie on. Everybody's in the movie. He says, could we watch the rest of it before we go? I said, nope, we've got to go now. I didn't blame him. So we went down and got him in the airplane. And there was in those days, a radio range that did dit bit. So I pulled up, and I got a little higher than my 200 feet, and I got up on the instruments, and I flew down straight southwest till I picked up the range, and the leg went right into Barrow. So I got on that leg and rode it into Barrow, and I could see down as I got to Barrow. I could see the Quonset huts and so forth, and I lined myself up with this little old lake and came in and landed. It was not extremely dangerous, but it wasn't free and clear of danger. So then when they brought the weasel out and pulled the airplane back up to where we parked it and tied it down, and I got the weasel, and they took me back down to my quarters and took this kid on down to Coast and Geodetic Survey headquarters. I got on the phone, called up the commander, and gave him my opinion of his operation. And he called Fairbanks. First he called the guy in charge of pilots at Barrow and tried to get me fired. They wouldn't fire me. Called Fairbanks, got the local manager, tried to get him to fire me. They wouldn't fire me. And he called Oakland, headquarters of Transocean Airlines, tried to get them to fire me, and they wouldn't fire me. All we did, I transferred up to Umiat, where I didn't have to do any of their flying anymore. They put another pilot on their fly. But I parted company with the Coast and Geodetic Survey that day.
Fur buyers, and they really took on to aircraft. Aircraft really helped them get around.
Or as in the early days, the fur buyers would have to go around with dog team to visit the villages, and of course it was a much more time-consuming thing, and they couldn't get into as many villages because of the time lag. But after the advent of the aircraft, or airplane, the fur buyers could go all over the country in a short space of time and trade. Of course, many people have the idea that the fur buyers really went around and dealt with trappers, and that was very unusual to deal with a trapper. Fur buyers dealt with the traders. The traders would bankroll, if you will, or grub stake the trappers on the credit, and then the trapper would use his fur catch to get off the books, and the local trader took a very dim view of a fur buyer buying directly from his customers, and he would not get paid. This was a frequently used ploy, is that a trapper would get his grub stake from the trader in one village and then take his furs and sell them in another village, and then never pay the fellow from whom he got his winter supply or his winter supplies. So the fur buyers didn't ordinarily deal directly with the trapper, unless, of course, they were in an area where there was no store. And the fur buyers were a rather unusual lot, and for my part, they were the best customers when I was in the flying business I could get, because they never quibbled over the price. They knew how much we were going to charge them for the airplane per hour. They weren't looking at their watches and took off and landing. They weren't writing down times. When you got down to the end of the trip, they'd say, "How much do you owe you?" And you tell them, and they never quibbled the least bit on it. There were, though, some parts of fur buying that I really didn't like. And I had yet to haul a fur buyer around that didn't have a briefcase full of booze. And the booze was used not directly for furs, but to affect the bargaining process of the furs. Booze when the fur buyer was in, booze would flow. It would flow in all directions. So that's one part of the fur buying that I didn't like. Other than that, they were my favorite types of customers. Then they went out, of course. The traveling fur buyer is a thing of the past, as far as I know, because the little trader went out, the fellow who was the middleman for the furs. You don't find these little stores in the villages, or you don't find independent stores in the village with the capital to finance the trapping of furs. So I've been in the villages lately, well, especially I'm thinking of Beaver. In the town of Beaver, there are two little stores, and neither of them has the stock in either of them wouldn't fill up my bathroom. I mean, as far as the area, and both of them are operating in private homes. So these people have no capital to go into the fur business. So when you might say, big traders went out of the villages, then the traveling fur buyer became a thing of the past. Now they mail them out to the Seattle Fur Exchange or some fur exchange like so.
So regular mail service also changed the fur buyers' effectiveness.
Oh, yes. Mail service and there's another item that changed the fur buying too, and that is there has been a decrease in the number of native trappers through the years, for whatever reason you might find, and an increase in the non-native trappers out there who are much more independent and businesslike, and who are less likely to become dependent upon a trader. And let's face it, these traders didn't lose money on these furs. I mean, many of them became quite wealthy out there. Some of them, who were not good businessmen, of course, didn't. But many of them went in with very little and came out quite a bit, and it was all on the fur trade and from the native trappers. And the non-native trappers out there cut out the middleman as much as possible. That had a bearing on the fur buying.
Okay.
We talk about the transition from the old days to the new days, the middle days, and so forth. And there's nothing, I think, more illustrative of this than an incident that happened to me many years ago. I was flying for Fish and Wildlife, and I was going down below McGrath toward Stony River, and there was a little old cabin in a little place called Black Wasky. And I was going by there, and a fellow ran out on the ice, just waved his hands, and waved, and just like that. So I thought there was something wrong, and I wondered what was wrong. And so I made a turn around and landed, and it was on the river there, and clear space. So I landed out in front of his place, and he came running up. I said, "What's the trouble here? What's the problem?" Well, he said, "I just wanted to say hello, you know." Well, the airplanes were not common enough or frequent enough in there. Here, the airplane was still something. And in my day, too, in the wintertime especially, when I would land at a village, the whole bloody village would come down on the ice, onto the river, to see who it was, because airplanes were not frequent. Now, when you got 6, 8 airplanes coming in every day, they don't care who's coming in, anything like so. I remember once landing at Hooslia. Now, Hooslia is a village that was established, it moved from a place called Cutoff. Now, Cutoff was flooded about every spring, and so they finally decided they would move downriver onto some high ground that wouldn't get flooded, and they moved down, and they called the village Hooslia. I remember I hadn't been into Hooslia, my first trip into Hooslia, after having been into Cutoff a number of times. In the winter, I had a fur buyer, and we dropped into Hooslia. We were walking up the bank, and I heard some little 4 or 5-year-old kid, yap, 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 in his native language, and I didn't understand what he's saying. But another kid, 8 or 10 years old, maybe a little older, said, yap, 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 Red Williams. Little kid was asking, "Well, who is this guy?" He hadn't seen me. He's now 4 or 5 years old enough to realize that people are individuals, and wondered who this individual was. The other kid, though, had remembered me from being in his village, and I slept on old Jack Sackett's store floor a lot of times, and what's his name? Sam White used to practically live on that floor every other night. He even made a lot of trips from Ruby over to Cutoff. But you were an event in those days, if you will. And you came in the village, everybody came out to see who it was. But so no more. There's no more. I mean, it's commonplace.
Yeah. I guess, too, in the early days at medical emergencies, airplanes were just real critical in meeting medical rings when their planes were reliable enough to get in.
Yeah, they. I never had too many medical emergencies. Once when we were teaching at Fort Yukon, about 1 o'clock in the morning, Dr. Palmer came pounding on our door. and it was socked in, and it was snowing, and he asked me, would I take a woman to Fairbanks? She's having a breech birth, and he couldn't handle it. He wanted to get her to Fairbanks. They'll kill her. I said, I said, doctor, I'm teaching school here. I said, you got 2 commercial operators here. Ween Airlines pilot lives next door to me, and Fort Yukon Air Service, Cliff Fairchild is up to got a cabin. Get them. I said, I'm teaching school. They won't go. He said, I'll try them. They won't go. I said, well, you take her. Well, I said, all right. But Ween did warm up my airplane. They had the master heaters and stuff up the field, which I didn't have. They warmed up my airplane, so I got up, and he called them and told them that, asked them to warm my airplane up, which they did. So I went up the airplane and checked the airplane out, said ready. So then when it was ready to go, I sent word over to the hospital to bring her on, and came back that the kid had turned around and had been born. Because I was going to go up there about 10,000 feet or 9,000 feet and fly on the instruments all the way to Fairbanks, single engine instruments. I don't like single engine instruments, but, well, I was proficient enough. I mean, I could, as long as that engine keeps, see, the only thing that bothered me is that engine running. As long as that keeps going, I have no problems. But when that quits, then I get to sweat a little bit.
The economic situation was different for the early pilots and for your group.
Oh, yes. In the early days, there weren't many of the pilots. And consequently, when people recognized the convenience of aviation as vis-a-vis the dog team and the river poling boat and all this type of thing, there was heavy demand. And the early bush pilots were as busy as they wanted to be. There wasn't a competition. Now, if my group, after the war, especially World War II, much competition. There's so many pilots and so many people going in the business that it was very difficult to, unless one had a good, unique service to offer. It was dog eat dog. Now, in my own case here, about the same time that I opened up here after the war, we had a group of us here. There was Bob Rice, who ran the Brat service, Bob Rice Air Taxi. And we had Randy Acord, who had a Beechcraft Bonanza. Rice had a Navion. And I was fighting and McGoffin. We all opened up at about the same time. Now, out of the bunch, McGoffin is the only one that really blossomed, and he blossomed because of the dew line connection he made in 1953. But the three of us, Rice and Acord and I, were concentrating primarily on the tourist business in the summertime. We were very competitive for the tourist business. And it was good for a while. And because during World War II, there was limited travel. And the farmers got good prices for their products. They couldn't go anywhere, and they stuck their money in the sock. And after the war, they were all ready to travel. And many of them would drive, and especially the challenge of the Alaska Highway, that was a big challenge. Many of them would drive up here and then want to fly to Kotzebue and Nome or Barrow. And we were all in. Ween was getting it, finally got smart and started concentrating on tourists and their Barrow and Kotzebue and Nome flight, that big round robin, made a lot of money for them. Rice and A-Corps were flying a lot over Fort Yukon, because Fort Yukon is 8 miles north of the Arctic Circle, and everybody wanted to go north of the Arctic Circle. And that was my big thrust too, because most of my customers drove as far as Circle Hot Springs, and of course I could fly them cheaper from Circle Hot Springs to Fort Yukon and back than they could fly from Fairbanks to Fort Yukon and back, until they put in the big fields and we could take in the big planes. And then when they did that, they just knocked the bottom out of us. They drove A-Corps out of business. They drove me out of business, and drove Rice out of business. He went to work as pilot for various and sundry companies and finally became a helicopter pilot. But they drove the big airlines and the big planes and the big airfields, drove all the small operators out of business. You couldn't compete with them with a small airplane. That's just like trying to compete with Weaver Brothers and their big 18-wheel rigs with a pickup truck. It takes the same number of people to drive the truck, whether it's a pickup or whether it's an 18-wheeler, but the loads are different.
But you were in that unique position of being near Circle Hot Springs in Central.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a pretty good corner on the market out of Circle Hot Springs, except on the 4th of July. Both Randy A-Corps and Bob Rice would come up there and actually compete with me, try and steal a lot of business from me, if you will, and make me mad and the devil. But nothing I can do about it. It's a free public air force. But they cut in on me. On 4th of July, they'd come up there and cut in on me.
So there really was a tourist circuit. They would drive to Circle Hot Springs, and then you'd fly into...
Most of my customers were people who had driven, who had arrived, whether they'd driven themselves or come on the bus or stage, as they call it in those days. They'd wind up by road and still want to go over the Arctic Circle and see the old former trading post, the British founded trading post in 1847 and so forth. Historic place, the biggest Indian village in Alaska, in the interior of Alaska. And it had attraction. And I made a living for a while, finally got wiped out.
So then you combined teaching in the winter with the summer?
Yes, and that way I didn't really have to make my living completely from flying. But there did come a time and for years I would, even after I went out of business for myself, when I was flying for hire, when I was flying for someone else's airplanes, I was always flying for hire. I would be teaching in the winter and then flying in the summer. So I didn't have to depend on the flying for my family support. But there came a time, actually later, when my flying barely supported the upkeep of the airplane. And that's when I got out of the personal flying business and went to work for others.
And when did commercial flight start to the villages?
Well, back with Ben Eielson.
I'm sorry, scheduled commercial flights.
Oh, those started in the late 30s, the mail contracts, and but when we were at early 50s or late 40s and early 50s at Central, the scheduled mail plane was once every 2 weeks. Okay, so there wasn't enough volume generated, and I sometimes question whether there's a volume generated now that to warrant these daily flights, often mail flights into places. I think we're subsidizing a lot of letter writing.
So the third stage after you guys really was when there was an accelerated scheduled commercial.
Oh yes, and it was well, the schedules they're able to keep the schedules more tightly with the sophisticated instrumentation and the navigational aids and so forth they have now. They're much able to keep a tighter schedule than they were 20, 30 years ago. So it's much more reliable.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say it's much more safe, but it's much more reliable. The only thing is, it was just, I figured that my group was just as safe as these people are now because we're here talking to you about it.
Anything else you'd like to add to the record?
No, I would just like to say that in all the years of flying, the greatest personal damage that was done to either my passengers or to me was one time I tore my fingernail on a landing. That's I've never brought blood on anybody or myself.
Well, that's a real good record.
My most horrible experience was I was flying a twin Cessna. I was landing at Circle Hot Springs with a full load of passengers, and a hornet was up my pants leg, stinging my leg 5 times on the landing, and there's nothing I could do about it. That's my most horrible flying experience. Imagine having a hornet up your leg, and you're sitting there, you're landing, you can't take your hands off and start swatting.
Thanks, Ray.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to the Arctic Archives. If you enjoyed this episode, a rating or review helps the show reach more people. And if you have a story of your own you'd like to share, I'd love to hear it. You can reach me by emailing contact@arcticarchivespodcast.com. Until next time.